Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shalom Hartman Institute. My name is Alan Abbey, and I'm the moderator for tonight's program. We're running a few minutes late, so we'll get right to it. We have a very interesting presentation by two speakers. The first one is Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He's in our New York office. The second presenter tonight is Dr. Haroon Moghul, who is a fellow of the Hartman Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative. And Haroon was supposed to be sitting side by side with Yehuda in New York, but the only thing that could take him away from this program was an invitation from the President of the United States, and he got one. So Haroon is with President Obama in Baltimore, and if everything is working as it should tonight, we will hear from Haroon directly from Baltimore. He has also pre-recorded his presentation so he can have the benefit of his planned talk, and again, if all goes well, we should be able to have Haroon with us live from Baltimore on the phone, but I'm not making any promises. Okay, so I want to get right to it. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He's a widely regarded speaker and author, and he runs our New York and North New York office and our North American programs. Tonight, the topic of tonight's program is coping with troubling texts, and you'll see how challenging some classic Jewish and Islamic texts can be, and how we can find ways to understand them in a modern context. Yehuda, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay in Jerusalem. It's wonderful to be with you all who are in Jerusalem as part of this conference, and I want to congratulate my colleagues in Israel for the important work right now. It's hard to imagine, given the state of the world right now, anything in the sphere of moral leadership that's more urgent than bridge building across faith difference, political difference, and ethnic difference. I think a lot of our work at the Hartman Institute, especially with the Muslim Leadership Initiative, goes to the heart of that work. And obviously a conference right now in Israel on Jews and Arabs is a critical feature of that work as well. As Alan mentioned, our goal today is to talk about the deficiencies, moral and political, of our religious traditions, and to try to publicly and self-consciously, self-reflectively, think about what it means to respond to those very deficiencies. And the goal today is not apologetics, but honesty. And it goes as follows, and to give a problematic analogy, Homer Simpson has a great quote in which he says, alcohol is both the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. Comparably, I'd like to think that if religion right now is one of the central drivers of much of the tension around the world, one of the sources of so many problems, political and violent and otherwise, I think this institution believes that courageous religious leadership is going to be one of the mechanisms that can provide solutions to those world's problems. And so to that spirit, we've asked Haroon and me to speak a little bit about the challenges of our own tradition, to acknowledge the problematics and the brokenness of our own tradition, and try to think about how and what it means as religious thinkers and speakers to confront the difficult texts of our own tradition. My topic is what I want to call the paradox of the apologetic, which is that oftentimes the attempt to clean up a problem in a religious tradition, to try to distance oneself from that problem, or to claim that your religious tradition can't coexist with the way that the most broken ways of reading that tradition are being used, requires making an exceptionalist argument. That is, you wind up cleaning up your religious tradition on the theory that it can't be bad, and what that does is it implies that your religious tradition is inherently good. The route of apologetics is towards a claim of a kind of moral superiority of the religion itself. Muslims are oftentimes accused of this when they are asked, oftentimes polemically, to respond to the way in which other Muslims use the religious tradition to justify violence and hate. And one of the arguments that's oftentimes adduced is those people who are doing that are not really Muslim. And the implication when somebody says something like that is that Islam can't represent problematic ideas, which is in itself an exceptionalist argument and opens up to a whole other moral deficiency. And I suspect that Jews do this as well. The more that you try to whitewash the aspects of your own tradition, you're making an implicitly morally exceptional claim about that tradition itself and implying that your religion is above all of its most problematic readings. So that's the challenge I want to do. And the way I wanted to present that was to look at really one of the, in list of if every religious tradition has its greatest hits, it also has like the 10 things, the 10 texts, the 10 ideas that you wish you could get rid of, that you would like feel better as a Jew if this wasn't a story that was part of our canon. And I want to pick one of those top 10. It's not one of the ones that's usually adduced, but it's a really terrible story from the book of 2 Samuel about David and King David and the Gibeonites. And I want to look at the ways in which first the Talmud and then Maimonides attempt to reconcile this stain on the legacy of King David. And I want to demonstrate in doing so that in order to fix a problem, which is that King David does things that are morally reprehensible, the way that the tradition ultimately fixes it is by introducing what I think is not an equally morally reprehensible problem, but in some ways a comparably bad issue, which is the idea that Jews can't ever be or do anything bad or wrong. To do this, I want to read through quickly the first couple of sources, and I'll just point to a couple of key pieces and summarize the story as it takes place in the book of Joshua, chapter 9 and chapter 10. The story in Joshua 9 and 10 describes that the Israelites are coming through into the conquest of the land of Israel and about to confront all of the various nations, as it's listed in verse 1, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. On one hand, we get the listing of all of their ethnicities. On the other hand, it doesn't really matter. As we'll see in this text and elsewhere, our tradition plays fast and loose with the Gibeonites can become the Nittanites, or in this case, can become the Hivites and or the Amorites. So we both care about them, but we also don't particularly care about the nuances of them. All of these nations are hearing about and about to confront militarily the Israelites in their march through the land, but one nation in particular, the Gibeonites, here's what had happened to Jericho and tricks the Israelites by essentially masking themselves as poor travelers from a faraway land. If they're from a faraway land, they're not incorporated or included in the conquest of the land of Israel. And therefore they say, why not make a peace treaty with us, because we're not part of the nations that are supposed to be conquered. And if you look at verse 14, the key line is, the leaders partook of the provisions and did not ask direction from the Lord. That is, they agreed to a peace agreement with this tribal population without asking for divine's permission. And verse 15 closes the deal. Joshua made peace with them, guaranteeing their lives by a treaty, and the leaders of the congregation swore an oath to them. And what this sets up as the political problem that the Israelites are now going to have to deal with is that on one hand, they violated God's rule by making a deal with the inhabitants of the land to not conquer them. On the other hand, in order to seal that deal, they swore by an oath to the Lord. And what will happen throughout the remainder of these texts is that the form of piousness and loyalty is to the oath that the Israelites pledged more than to the violation against God that they had originally committed. And it goes on to say they realized that they were actually among their neighbors and they were supposed to massacre them and not live alongside with them. Verse 18, the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord. All the congregation murmured against the leaders, because now, where it's usually not the case, but the congregation of Israel feels a sense of loyalty to God, but the leaders had made a pledge to God that was in violation of that rule. And the leaders say to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel, and now we must not touch them. The result of this deal, that is, the Israelites making a deal with a tribal population living in the land to not kill them, is that they remain in the story throughout the books of the prophets and the writings as a kind of lingering tale of the lack of loyalty by the Israelites to what they were supposed to do, but paradoxically, an affirmation of the loyalty of the Israelites to the oath that they had made in God's name. And the story resolves itself at the end of this chapter by saying, Joshua says to them, why did you trick us? And they say, well, we were scared of you. And the result is that they live as a kind of subpopulation, an ethnically different group of people who in some ways are part of the community of the Israelites, but are also to be considered somewhat different. Verse 23 is a very loaded verse. Now, therefore, you are cursed, and some of you shall always be slaved, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of God. So on one hand, you are going to be essentially like a slave class within this population, but it's hard not to read a kind of hearkening back to the book of Deuteronomy, when the covenant is made not just with those who are standing with us, but those who are not here, including those who are the hewers of wood and drawers of water. So there's like a weird thing being played out here about an ethnic subpopulation that in some ways is part of the people of Israel and included in the covenant, but also meant to be considered separate. The fulfillment of this oath comes in the next chapter, when in chapter 10, verse 6, in the next page of the sources, the Gibeonites sent to Joshua and say, "Do not abandon your servants. Come quickly and save us, for all the rest of the tribes are surrounded around us." And Joshua, in coming to save the Gibeonites in the midst of a war against the Israelites and the rest of the surrounding tribes, is fulfilling this promise that the Israelites made by mistake. Now, so far, so good. Our ancestors screwed up. We have plenty of stories about that. But now they've essentially said, we've decided to not kill off this tribal population. And that should in some ways be a good story from our tradition, that we made a deal. It may have been a rotten deal, but we're now pledged to hold by it. Last thing I want to point out before unpacking the problematic is on verse 26, the symbol of the deal is that the 5 kings who they actually do go to war against get hanged out in public until the evening. So a kind of sealing of the deal is that instead of killing the Gibeonites, we killed the other kings. The problem emerges in 2 Samuel chapter 21, where it becomes clear, and I'm not going to read through it because we have limited time, but the problem that emerges is that it turns out that Saul, King Saul, had actually tried to wipe out the Gibeonites in violation of this deal, and this is resulting in a famine that's being cast on the Israelites. So now God is essentially holding the Israelites accountable for their violation of the deal that they had made with the Gibeonites. David says to the Gibeonites in verse 3, "What should I do for all of you? How shall I make expiation?" And the Gibeonites say, "It's not gold and it's not silver. It was Saul. And therefore," verse 6, "let 7 of Saul's sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord at Givon, at the mountain of the Lord." And King David says, "I will hand them over." This is like a devastating, horrible, horrendous text. What does it mean for the king of the Israelites to make expiation for the sins of his predecessor by massacring the 7 innocent children of King Saul? And what does it mean actually theologically that the result of this, and there's more to unpack in the story, but the result of this is that God eliminates the famine from the people. And I'm left with, as a reader of the tradition, this is what it means to say confronting a difficult text. I'm left as a reader of this tradition, on one hand, imagining that King David, our ancestor, is the ideal king from the perspective of Jewish and biblical tradition, the kind of exemplar around whom we imagine the Messianic age. On the other hand, he very quickly, almost callously, is willing to sacrifice, massacre, and ultimately crucify Saul's children to reconcile with a deal that was made by his ancestors. Maybe I should be proud of the fact that they were loyal to the deal, but the cost is the moral intuition. Where is David David who would remind us of the Genesis of Abraham, the Abraham of Genesis 18, fighting back against an immoral commandment or immoral obligation, even though it seems to be what God wants. The rabbis, as a result of this problem, confronted with a version of David who they find to be untenable, clean him up. The rabbis do this all the time. They rabbinize biblical characters to make them more rabbinic. And in this case, it's not just making him more rabbinic, but making him more pious. And the rabbinic version of this account in Yevamot 78b to 79a, the rabbis substitute or incorporate a whole bit of dialogue on the back and forth of all of the inquiries that David made within the camp of Israel to make sure that the reason that the Israelites were being punished was precisely because of this violation to the Gibeonites. So it's correcting problem number 1, which is David seems really willing to accept this narrative of the Gibeonites. It corrects that problem. And the second problem it corrects is it signals that even though the text had said explicitly, they said, send us 7 of your children, and he said, okay, David actually tries to pacify them. I'm reading 6 lines up from the end. He tried to pacify them, but they would not be pacified. And it's as a result of their character traits and not David being as cruel and violent as them. They created the conditions that required of the Israelites to do something terrible. What the rabbis then do, thereupon David said to them, our nation, this nation, is distinguished by three characteristics: merciful, meek, and benevolent. In other words, the result of this text, according to the rabbis, is not a sense of embarrassment or shame that we have this violent instinct or this violent predisposition, but they do. And sometimes they, being bad, force us who are inherently good to do things that are against our will. It essentially exonerates David of any wrongdoing, and in doing so, constructs an essential difference between the us and the them. What's most astonishing is what Maimonides does with it next, and with this I'll conclude, is that he entrenches this distinction between the us and the them into Jewish law, which is to say, Maimonides says, all families have acceptable lineage and is permitted to marry into them without reservation. However, in other words, everybody's okay to marry. However, if you see families quarreling with each other, or if you see one family always involved in quarrels, or a person who's very quarrelsome, we suspect them of their lineage. This is an incredibly subversive idea about ethnicity and ancestry, that lineage and ancestry are expressed through our moral characteristics as opposed to through our bloodline, and it's best to stay away from them. As he goes on to say, 8 lines up from the bottom, any brazen or cruel person, or one who hates others and does not perform acts of kindness towards them and cruelty, we are very suspicious that he is a Gibeonite. Now look how amazing this is. What I've now done is I've translated the bad moral characteristics that I attribute to others as defining characteristics of the them, and in return, we, the Israelites, have the distinguishing characteristics of meekness, mercy, and kindness, right? Because the Gibeonites are not of the Jewish people. They were brazen, they refused to be appeased, and were not merciful towards the sons of Saul. And they did not act kindly towards the Jews by refusing to forgive the sons of their king, whereas the Jews had acted kindly towards them and had allowed them to live in the beginning. Look what an amazing rhetorical trick Maimonides and the rabbis have done, which is, I had this messy, ugly story about David's transgression and his wrongdoing, his willingness to sacrifice the sons of Saul in order to pacify the Gibeonites. And in order to salvage David, what I've had to do is construct an essential difference between Jews who are good people and the people who force us to do bad things who are bad people. Now, this is kind of the full circle that I tried to allude to at the beginning, the paradox of the apologetic. I'm trying to deal with a bad moral frame from within my tradition itself. And in order to do so, I wind up having to make a moral claim about my superiority over others, which is in and of itself a morally deficient argument. I'm going to pause here. I want us to hear from Haroon in trying to work through his own religious tradition as well. But I suspect that part of the moral obligation that we are cast to deal with as people in the modern world is how to both own the moral culpability of our religious tradition, as in the David story, and how to also be cautious of the effort to surface arguments that signal that we don't want to be implicated by David in that story. We don't want to be the people of David in response to the Gibeonites. How do we prevent, in our efforts to not be David, not become the people of Maimonides, not to assume that just because we don't want to be implicated by the bad moral stories in our tradition, that we have to make of ourselves a kind of moral exceptionalism that in and of itself can translate to a kind of racism. So let me pause there and turn it over to our recorded talk from Haroon, and hopefully we can hear from both of us in conversation afterwards.
Thanks, Yehuda. We're going to now use that video of Haroon. I don't think we're going to be able to get him on the phone, but we'll see. The hour isn't over yet. So now if we can see that recording. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Haroon Moghul. I will be presenting 6 texts to you, which are particularly relevant, I think, to the present moment in the Muslim world and in Muslim communities around the world. The title of this seminar is Troubling Texts. And of course, before we choose texts, we have to decide what troubles us. So I realize that in selecting these texts, there is a bias at work. I'm looking at texts that I believe is relevant to the present Muslim world, understanding many of the debates and conversations that are roiling the Muslim world, and to many of the most intense painful and divisive conversations that take place in Muslim communities around the world. Even if these texts are not necessarily immediately relevant, they affect many Muslims because they shape our relationship to the wider world. I will give you a little bit of a background to help us understand these texts. There are 6 of them. The first 2 constitute part of what we would call Sharia, or Islamic law, as it's casually called. And the subsequent 4 texts, number 3 through 6, are contemporary 20th century texts by Islamic modern thinkers who are attempting to really wrestle with some of the ideas in these texts and to make sense of them for a modern age. So the 2 are the source texts that all Muslims use in their day-to-day life, in their understanding of religion, and believe are part of their religion. And 3, 4, 5, and 6 are modern interpretations and contestations of some of the ideas in the text. So given that, I'm going to start by giving you an overview of number 1 and number 2, and then we'll jump to the second group, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Probably you've heard the word Sharia before. Maybe you know a little bit about it. If you don't, I will say that Sharia in Arabic literally means the path to the water, the means by which you arrive at a certain destination, or the means at which you find salvation. So an analogy to halakha would not be inappropriate or incorrect. Many of the functions of Islamic sacred law are similar. Many of the ideas and debates and interpretive issues underneath are also very similar. So Sharia means the path to the water. In the Muslim tradition, it is composed of 2 primary sources. First of these is the Quran, and the second of these is what we call the Sunnah, or the path of the Prophet Muhammad. The Sunnah is composed of everything he did or said, approved of or rejected, implicitly or explicitly, as recorded in different books. The 2 texts that I'm starting with are from the Sunnah. They are called hadith, or reports, from hadatha in Arabic, which means to tell or to report or transmit. Oftentimes in modern Arabic, it's used to describe the news. So basically to describe what's happening. So the Quran is what Muslims believe is the word of God, literally transmitted via Gabriel through Muhammad, and preserved in its original form. The Sunnah is a little bit more contentious because most Muslims believe that the Sunnah is God implicitly guiding Muhammad to live out the Quran and the values of the Quran in his daily life. So to give you a very simple example of how Sharia often functions, and we'll go to text 1 to help us understand it better, is a Muslim scholar or thinker will first approach the Quran and then approach the hadith to help understand the Quran. So if there's a verse from the Quran that's a little bit confusing, a little bit contentious, or perhaps open to multiple interpretations, your immediate next move is to go to the Sunnah to say, okay, what does the Sunnah, what do the Prophet say about this, and what can we draw from it? So given that, the first text I'm starting with in your booklet, it's titled, What is Sharia? It is a hadith of a very famous incident from very late in the Prophet Muhammad's life. So he's born in the year 570, and he dies in the year 32. The Muslim belief is that he is alive for long enough to basically completely transmit the message of Islam to humanity. So this text comes from the last year of his life. And basically, it is him talking to one of the closest companions about what his responsibility will be in his absence. Towards the end of his life, much of Arabia had accepted Muhammad as a prophet, and the people of Yemen sent messengers to him in his capital, Medina, which was several hundred miles north, and basically said, look, we're converting to Islam, and we'd like for you to send us some people to teach us Islam. Obviously, at the time, they didn't have modern technology, so the Prophet gathers together a group of very wise companions and says to them, I'm going to send you to Yemen, and you're going to go there and teach Islam. And he takes one of them, whose name is Mu'adh, and he says to Mu'adh, you will be their leader, because Mu'adh was widely esteemed in the community and is esteemed in the tradition as one of the premier interpreters of the sources of Sharia. So the Prophet has this exchange with Mu'adh in public. And he's basically asking Mu'adh, what are you going to do in my absence? And I want to underline the word absence, because for Muslims, the challenge really happens when the Prophet dies, and now you have this interpretive vacuum. where suddenly you have the Quran and what the Prophet did, but you no longer have a living link that can authoritatively and definitively interpret the Quran for you. And essentially what Muhammad is doing, he's describing this. So he says, how will you judge? And Mu'adh says, according to the Quran, and you can see this in the text before you. And Muhammad says, if you find nothing there, and Mu'adh says, then I will look to the Prophet's example, to the path of God's messenger, the Sunnah. And then Muhammad says, what if you find nothing there? And Mu'adh says, then I will strive my utmost, the word is ijtihad, to form my own judgment. Now this is a really important text because basically what it's saying is that there is scope for human reason and interpretation, and it is preparing the community for the fact that Muhammad is going to die. And as such, the community is going to have to figure out for itself what it's supposed to do with these questions, these sources. The second text, and I'll scan it very briefly, you have it before you if you want to read it in more detail, is the Prophet telling someone that the example of myself and the prophets, meaning the prophets previous to him, so, David, Solomon, Moses, Jesus, so on and so forth, the example of us is of a man who has built a house and completed it and beautified it. When people enter the house, they admire its beauty and say, but for this brick. He seems to be pointing, in interpretations of this text, to a building that was completed save for one brick. And the challenge that Muslim scholars have had with this very vague text is, what is he talking about? He seems to be suggesting that everything in the house is perfect, but there's one brick that's off, or missing, or somehow different. And people have taken this to mean all kinds of things. That the tradition as a whole is remarkably unified and holistic and speaks to many things. Others have said that perhaps the tradition is one that necessarily leaves things out which people will actually point out and realize, and it doesn't really tell you what to do with that. All it really says is that something is left that is left hanging. And the reason I use these two texts is because they've been very powerful in helping us to understand the dilemma of modern Islam. I know you've seen headlines and the tumult and the divisions and sometimes outright violence in much of the Muslim world. And some of it, I believe, has to do with a simple problem. When Muhammad died, the system that evolved after him was basically oriented around what we call a caliphate. Someone who is delegated to act in the absence of Muhammad, not as a religious leader, but as a political representative of the unity or the ideal unity of the community. And of course, the symbol was far more potent than the reality of the authority behind it. But in the early 1920s, the last caliphate was deposed. And that decision threw much of the Muslim world, and especially the Sunni Muslim world, which is about 80% of the world's Muslims, into crisis. Because the entire edifice of Sunni Islam, of how we interpret texts, of how we relate to each other, of how we define our relationship to the world, of how we define our relationship to each other, all gets rooted in this idea of a caliphate that grows out of the Islamic tradition. It is a little bit like, and I know it's not the perfect analogy, but it's a little bit like if the papacy were to be dissolved and the world's Catholics would suddenly find themselves struggling with what they're supposed to do next. Are they supposed to establish another papacy? Are they supposed to maybe move on to another form of authority? Perhaps they don't believe they need any authority. And the perversity of it is, and the surprising fact of it is that there now is a caliph. The self-declared head of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is nearly universally reviled by the world's Muslim authorities, but has nevertheless done what no one has done in nearly 100 years, which is declare a caliphate. So the four texts that I have are from a period in time, beginning in the 1920s, when some of the foremost minds of the Muslim world were struggling with this question of the old way is dead, what is the new way? And the tradition really calls you to go back to the basics and to ask yourself all over again, perhaps, what is our relationship to these texts and what is the relationship of religion to modern life? So I want to very briefly scan them because I know I I suppose this is a problem every academic has, that we choose far too much material and there's not enough time to cover all of it. But I chose 4 texts. 3 are from South Asians, so people in the Indian subcontinent. I chose that for a few reasons. 1, because I'm South Asian, so there's a bias. 2, because about 500 million Muslims live in South Asia. 3, because sometimes I think we focus on Islam exclusively as a Middle Eastern religion, and this is not to put down any part of the world, but instead to point out that the Muslim experience is incredibly diverse, and there are many different responses to the same challenges, and I wanted to draw our attention in a different direction. Also, small admission, this is what I studied academically, so I'm more comfortable with material. The first text is by a scholar named Ali Abdul Razak, who's Egyptian, who basically argues, and I'll quote very briefly from this, that Islam was never intended to be a political system, and the abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate was not a bad thing, but a good thing, because it eliminated an institution that our religion never called for in the first place. So at a time when many religious Muslims were in dismay and disarray because of the abolition of the Caliphate, he basically says we never needed it in the first place. And so in the 3rd paragraph of this text, he says, during all his life, the Prophet made no allusion to anything which could be called an Islamic state or an Arab state. It would be blasphemy to think otherwise. The Prophet did not leave this earth until he had entirely accomplished the mission given him by God. How then, if his work comprised the creation of a state, could he left the Muslims without any precise directions concerning that state? And what he was pointing to is the disarray that the Muslim community experienced after the death of Muhammad. And basically he's saying that when Muhammad dies, there's a lot of disagreement and debate among his followers, and very quickly violence and even civil war. And what Ali Abdul Razak is trying to point out is that if Muhammad was really intended to form a state and to pass on a state to us religiously, then why would he not have explicitly laid out directions as to how to govern and construct the state and how to pass on power from one leader to the next? That was a debate that almost nearly destroyed the early Muslim community. The second text is from a thinker from South Asia whose name is Abu al-Ala Maududi, who is the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is an Islamist party in South Asia that was a major influence on Sayyid Qutb. His movement comes later than the Muslim Brotherhood, but many of his ideas ended up influencing the Muslim Brotherhood, although the party structure was separate. It's interesting that Jamaat-e-Islami has had a huge influence on other parts of the Muslim world, although when it comes to elections in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the party has never done better than a handful of percentage points, and it's usually only came to power in collaboration with military dictators. But he has an interesting passage. It's the 3rd paragraph in this election, where he says the Islamic State is an ideological state. Islam is based on an ideology, and its objective is to establish that ideology. Whoever accepts this program, no matter to what race, nation, or country he may belong, can join the community that runs the Islamic State. Now that's an interesting text to me, because 1, he basically comes out and says Islam is an ideology, which is a word that didn't even exist in the Arabic of the Prophet's time. But 2, he seems to be drawing this out of the story of Mu'adh. The Prophet delegates to Mu'adh the right to interpret and rule as long as he goes back to the sources in the proper way. And Maududi argues that the caliphate was a problem not because of the nature of religious authority itself, but the form it took. And Maududi argues that every Muslim is theoretically a caliph, and therefore government must be by consensus, so long as that consensus is limited to people who agree with the ideological program in the first place. So it sounds democratic, but it's not really democratic. It is something of a meritocracy within very, very severe ideological limitations, and as you see in the text, he notes that people who are not Muslim or people who, shall we say, don't subscribe to the right idea of Islam will be protected under the state, he never says how, but will not be allowed to govern or rule or voice any opinion as to government. The final two texts, 5 and 6, relate to an interesting contrast to how we frame Islam. Muhammad Iqbal and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and I apologize that they have the same first name if it gets confusing, but Iqbal and Jinnah formed a partnership very much like Nehru and Gandhi. They were Muslims from South Asia who did the bulk of their political work in the 1920s and 30s, and basically came to believe that the large Muslim populations of the subcontinent should be somehow sovereign. Jinnah seemed most concerned with producing a secular state with a Muslim majority, and Iqbal believed in creating a democratic Muslim majority state. They had very different senses of what these states were intended to do, but they both go back implicitly and explicitly to our two source texts. For Iqbal, the purpose of Islam is found in this idea that Mu'adh communicates, that any Muslim can rule, and any Muslim can do ijtihad, any Muslim can, with the right education and background, attempt to understand Islam himself or herself. But the interesting thing about Iqbal is that his definition of ijtihad is incredibly vast. He goes so far as to argue that Ataturk, who pursued very secularizing, westernizing reforms in Turkey, was a religious leader because he was a Muslim who was attempting to figure out what Islam meant in the modern world. So Iqbal argues that Islam is not a caliphate in the traditional sense. It's not an ideological state, but it is instead a spiritual democracy or some kind of Islamic republic where the emphasis is on consensual government. Jinnah's text, the sixth text, seems to build off our second hadith. So if you read the last text, it's the address Muhammad Ali Jinnah gave after the establishment of Pakistan in 1947. The amazing thing about this text is here you have a man who has presided over the creation of what was at the time the largest Muslim nation in the world and one of the largest democracies in the world. Pakistan obviously subsequently split into two countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but nevertheless, Pakistan itself remains a very populous country. And Jinnah believed that the entire purpose of Pakistan was to create a Muslim-majority state where religion would be relegated to the private sphere. His founding address to the country makes absolutely no mention of religion, except insofar as people have their religious rights, no matter what religion they belong to. And his founding address makes no reference whatsoever to the Quran, or even to God or the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what's interesting about this text, to me, is that Jinnah seemed rooted in a tradition, and I wish I had the time to elaborate, which goes back to these two texts of the Prophet Muhammad, and says that when Muhammad was describing how Mu'adh was supposed to rule, he was not describing Mu'adh as a political leader, but as a religious interpreter. And Mu'adh's remit was exclusively religious interpretation and not political authority. And Jinnah therefore believed that Maududi was entirely wrong and Razik was entirely right. That religion was not supposed to be part of government, and that the second hadith of the Prophet, which refers to the collective enterprise of the prophets, and that one brick that sticks out, nevertheless was really actually just pointing to religious responsibility and not to political responsibility. And the Prophet's evocation of an element of the house that seems to be missing or somehow sticks out rather refers to the fact that the prophets and religious mission did not intend to speak to much of our life. And the reason why the example of a single brick was used is not because this part of their mission, or rather the private part of their mission, was somehow of a different order of importance, but that in the grand scheme of things, our private lives and our political lives are not the remit of religion in quite the way that Maududi would understand it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I believe we have Haroon on the phone from Baltimore. Haroon, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. I'm actually about to go in just a minute, so I apologize.
All right, Haroon, it's great to have you with us, and we won't keep you. I just wanted you to be able to take a minute to tell us, what do you think the president's visit to the Baltimore mosque today says about the status of Muslim Americans in the United States?
You know, it's an important gesture. I think many people have been worried that it's a little bit too late. That's been the common assumption, but I would say that actually it's actually more powerful now because it's just it's a more powerful time right now, given the optics and the fact that it's his first ever visit and the anti-Muslim climate.
Thank you very much, Haroon. We'll let you go. I guess you'll have to make our apologies to the president if we held him up. All right, I would like to now have a few questions. Yehuda, we had a few sent to us in advance of the program, so I'm going to read one or two to you, and then I have actually a question that Haroon did answer for us earlier. So let's start with that. Yehuda, actually, I'm going to give you this question and give you Haroon's answer as well. It says, Janice Michelson wrote to us. She said, what can we do to educate those who are not closed-minded about the Israeli-Palestinian situation to reach those who would be open-minded? If I find people who care about the situation, I usually find only extreme positions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that, look, I think one of the ways I think about this and struggle with it is how do you build a mass movement around nuance and subtlety? That's the hard question that's essentially being asked. It's very easy to identify strongly held positions, and strongly held positions oftentimes translate quickly into very loud rhetoric. And that loud rhetoric oftentimes is not fully representative of the mainstream populations. And I think we know that here in America with a lot of the loudest rhetoric, both about domestic politics, about ethnic groups, and so forth, and certainly it's the case in Israel as well. I think what we're trying to do here today, without being too meta, is actually a little bit of inhabiting that breach. What would happen if actually you tried to put together rational and reasonable people who actually genuinely don't agree on a lot? Haroon and I deeply disagree on some aspects of Middle Eastern politics, but part of the activity of trying to talk about our traditions, our religious traditions, wrestling with core questions of identity and meaning and doing it in front of each other is a way of building credibility on character through a kind of modeling of a kind of vulnerability that enables you to at least feel that you have allies in a conversation. I don't think, and I don't know if the question intends this, that the goal is to get everybody who agrees with you or disagrees with you to be on your side, as much as to try to reshape the way in which that public conversation about these conflicts can actually take place, with the theory that actually a better version of a public conversation about this actually has a better chance of advancing policy solutions that ultimately more people can wrap their heads around.
Thanks. I'll take the liberty of reading Haroon's answer to this very question. And he said that this is indeed the great question of our time. How do we find a space for discussion, debate, and dialogue as opinions become apparently ever more polarized? One of the strategies I have found, remember this is Haroon speaking, one of the strategies I have found effective is to work at building trust with people who might be across the aisle, so to speak, but have great authority or reach in their own communities. In the same way that an introduction to a stranger through a trusted friend transforms the potential of that new connection, so too might we think about trusted interlocutors as capable of opening doors that would otherwise remain shut to us. And we must trust those interlocutors to help us see our own blind spots. I'm going to finish. I will make some of these answers available later to you offline if you like. We have a few more minutes for questions. If anybody here wants to ask a question, please come over to the microphone so we can see you and hear from you. And if not, I have a few more questions that we received earlier. So really feel free to make your way to the microphone and ask a question. Okay, Yehuda, this one's for you. This is from Erwin Zeplowitz. What have religious authorities in the past used to discount or ignore these troubling texts? How can we respond to literalists or fundamentalists, both within our traditions and outsiders questioning each of our traditions, to explain how religious faith may evolve?
Look, so I think the epiphany that I had while I was listening to Haroon's talk is that many of us, you in the room, and I feel this personally. I think rabbis, scholars, imams everywhere who are trying to be on the side of what we're trying to talk about find themselves challenged, and I think this has been historically true, to be three things at the same time, or to do three things at the same time: to be translators of a tradition, transmitters of a tradition, and repairers of a tradition. I think the challenge is that all three of those activities are actually not the same, and at times they're at odds with each other. The people who are loudest in what they might call transmitting, that feel that their job is to be a mouthpiece of the past speaking into the present, are oftentimes the people who are least likely to think of themselves as repairers of that tradition. And the reverse is also true as well. To be a repairer of a tradition is oftentimes thought as an activity in which you're trying to fix something of the past, which wouldn't be fully captured by translating it or transmitting it. But I think this has actually been true throughout. I think when the rabbis, to use my example, think that they are fixing the problem of King David, it may be that they have a blind spot about what version of Judaism they're producing on the other end, but the moral urgency that they have to deal with is more that in the inheriting of David than it is in the production of the exceptionalism of Jewish tradition that emerges. So I actually find there's something incredibly courageous about both what the Talmud and Maimonides are trying to do here, which is to take a version of this tradition and make it morally viable for the people who are coming after them, to be translators of the original story, transmitters of it, and also repairers of it. I just think that the attempt to do so as moderns out loud and in public right now is so incredibly fraught. And part of, again, what it means to build a mass movement around this stuff is to trust ourselves and each other that we can be involved in these verbs, translating, transmitting, and repairing, all at the same time, as part of what religious sincerity looks like, as opposed to oftentimes the way that it's portrayed.
Okay, Yehuda, I have a few more questions, and now we've gone to the tough ones here. This is from Lori Spear. She writes, in the Siddur, Jews pray for the rebuilding of the temple in our time. How can Jews reimagine this text in a way that is not provocative and does not incite extremism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it requires different interpretations actually for American Jews and Israeli Jews. For American Jews, we have already effectively decided, by not making Aliyah when we have the opportunity to do so, we've already decided that we're making our future in America. And the implications for that are that all of this stuff, next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Passover Seder, has already been implicitly reinterpreted, I think, by many American Jews as being some sort of metaphor. We long for redemption. We long for a messianic age that's better tomorrow than it is today, and that we long for some Isaiah version of a vision of end of days where there is peace on earth and Jerusalem is a site of holiness for all of the people of faith around the world. I think that's an easier, subtle move for American Jews to make because they've already decided not to act politically on the messianic idea of praying for Jerusalem. I think for Israelis, it's a very different conversation. What it actually looks like to pray for rebuilding when Israelis are already intrinsically in the business. That's what Zionism is. That's what Judaism in Israel is the bridging between a classical tradition and its longing with lived political realities. And on this, I recommend David Hartman's book, Israelis in the Jewish Tradition, who identified, I think correctly, that this is the exact central philosophical challenge of Zionism in our time. How do you bridge between the excitement that the State of Israel creates to actualize Judaism for the Jewish people as part of concrete political realities without becoming a fundamentalist about that is the huge risk involved with translating those past paradigms into modern politics.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And you're welcome to, in fact, to dispute the premise here, but I'll read what the questioner said. This is from Clara Silver. She writes, How, in an age of great moral and ethical evolution, that is the 21st century, maybe there you might want to debate that point, are large numbers of people and communities still able to use ancient texts to propagate individual behaviors and broader cultures of violence, hatred, xenophobia, and discrimination? Why aren't these texts perceived more broadly as morally archaic and obsolete?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. Thank you, Clara. Clara is an alum of our Hillel Professionals program. I think honestly, the great hubris of modernity was the belief that emancipation, enlightenment, all of these factors of modernity were going to steamroll over this broken stuff that we called religion, and that we'd ultimately end up better moral human beings on the other side. That has proven both false in premise and untenable for two reasons. One is, it turns out that secularism and the moral vocabulary that is surfaced by anti-religion can be as morally pernicious as religion itself. So the great debate among scholars, theologians trying to understand the Nazis, is that, are they a triumph of a certain kind of religious fundamentalism, or are they a triumph of a certain type of immoral secularism? So number one, it's inherently possible for modernity and what you call the opposite of the morally archaic to produce morally bankrupt outcomes. The second is that religion has a more powerful force over the human spirit than modernity ever thought was possible. And you could say that condescendingly, people need religion, or you could say it theologically, God persists. But in either case, religion has a staying power over human imagination much more powerfully than the steamroller of modernity has ever given credit to be. That's why the urgent project is not trying to make one of these arguments win, religion versus the morality of modernity, but trying to surface an authentically modern moral discourse within religion itself. They need each other. They're codependent on each other. And the more that we insist on the premise and the framing of your question, the more we cast the morality of the modern world against the archaic religious tradition, the more we actually entrench religious tradition in being morally archaic. In other words, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And religion winds up being the kind of morally bankrupt thing that's actually diminishing our world. The most interesting work is actually trying to inhabit the breach and saying, how do I make an authentic religious tradition that speaks with a profoundly modern moral vocabulary, both for the sake of modernity and for the sake of the religion itself?
Thank you, Yehuda. We have, I think we've actually run out of time for questions. I'm very sorry. But I just want to say that despite all the high-tech work, what you've heard tonight, today in the United States, is a classic Hartman conversation. People talking, people listening, people not necessarily feeling they have to agree with one another, but talking in a way that they can learn from one another. And hopefully you have all learned from both Yehuda and Haroon tonight. And I want to thank you again, Yehuda and Haroon, wherever you are out there in Baltimore. Thank you very much. We invite those of us here in the room to stay with us for the last part of this program in a few minutes. And everybody watching online, we're going to sign off now, but this program will be available online soon on video, and some of the program recorded, some of the program happening later this evening about David Hartman will in fact be made visible online as well fairly soon. So thank you very much again.